All right, so let's get going again. Okay, so the next step along our little path here is going to be taking the stuff that we've done, right? So taking these characteristic truth tables, and we're going to start stitching all of these things together. So our next move is going to be constructing what we'll call a complete truth table. Complete truth tables can be for single sentences, they can be for multiple sentences, they can be for an entire argument. So we're going to start off by talking about a complete table for a single sentence, and then we'll go on to use it to talk about multiple sentences at a time. Okay? But it's worth knowing that's the kind of plan. So, a complete truth table. A complete truth table has a line for every possible assignment of truth or falsity to the relevant atomic sentences. That is, each line of the table represents a valuation, right? And a complete table has a line for every possible valuation. So put more bluntly, what the table does, what a complete truth table does, is it lets us look at every possible situation relevant to a particular sentence. And the size of a complete table is going to depend on the number of atoms we're dealing with. We've actually already kind of seen this idea when we were looking at the characteristic tables for the connectives. Right? A sentence containing only one atom is going to have two rows. The row where the atom's true and the row where the atom's false. Again, just think of the characteristic table for negation. That's what we saw. The whole table only had two rows, one where the input was true, one where the input was false. If we're looking at a sentence that has two atoms involved in it, well, then we're going to have four rows, right? Where they're both true, where the first one's true and the second's false, one where the first one's false and the second one's true, and then finally where they're both false. Again, just kind of mapping all the options. If we have three, then we're going to have 8 rows. Right? Again, just think about the different possible combinations. In fact, generally, if a sentence has n atoms, then its complete table has 2 to the n rows. That's just going to be all the assigned truth values we can give, all the combinations. So this kind of comes back to your man's question, I think, your man's question about how to kind of write the table, right? We want to make sure if we're making a complete table, we get every possible combination. So I'm going to suggest a method to do that. It's one that I think is very easy to do. When I suggest, it's not the only way you can do this, but it's a handy way to go. Right? So the way we're going to go when we construct our table, right, is you first pull out all of the atoms from your sentence you're looking at, right? However many there are. You're going to write them over on the left-hand side in an independent little mini table. And this is going to be your matrix. It's going to be the list of all the possible assignments of truth values to the atoms. So we'll pull them out and we'll list them. Let's say we've got a sentence with 3. So you pull out A, B, and C as your atoms. Then what we can do is you start with the one closest to your sentence. And you fill underneath it, alternating true and false. T, F, T, F, T, F, T, F. Right? However many times you need. Then the next column over, you do 2 T's, 2 F's, 2 T's, 2 F's, for however many you need. Then the next one over is 4. Then the next one over is 8, and so on and so on and so on, doubling every time you go. Now this is a lovely method because it's mechanical. You don't have to think, you don't have to worry about whether you've got every possible combination. You just do it automatically. So we'd start by writing true, false, and there'd be 4 more, but I've run out of board already, so you get the idea. What we do here True, 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 false. You double the amount, and then you do it again. We'll do it more in a second, so don't worry if you can't see the board. But we see the basic process, right? You start off just flipping from true to false, listing it. The next row over, you double the amount of trues in a row. Then the next row over, you double the amount of trues again. And we do this until we've listed every possible combination. So, here's an example. So we have a complex sentence, and we want to know when is this sentence going to be true and when is it false. So we start off by generating our matrix, generating the combination of all possible truth values, all valuations for our atomic sentences. First thing we do, we've already pulled out the three sentences, the three atoms, is we fill in the column closest to the sentence. True, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. Right. What do we do next? What's the next step? We go back, right? We take a step to the left. We double. True, true, false, false, true, true, false, false. Cool. So far, so good? And how about, what's our next step? We go to our last atom and we double it. Right? Now, this is a very handy mechanical way to list all of the possible combinations of truth values we could assign here. Again, you don't have to do it this way, but if you do it this way, you're never going to make a mistake, which is nice. Okay, so we've generated our matrix. This gives us all the valuations. And note that if we look at these three columns together, we take the three columns together, they list all relevant possible valuations. Every relevant possible situation, right, is just here. It's encoded into our table. There'll be tons and tons and tons of other ones, but they're either not relevant or are just going to be subsectors of this region of logical space. Right? So our next step to fill in the complete table is you find the occurrences of the relevant atoms and you copy the columns over. Right? So the column under C in our matrix, we copy over and paste under the occurrences, every occurrence of C in our sentence. And we do the same for A and for B. Right? So that's all I've done here. I've copied the relevant columns in the matrix and pasted them underneath the occurrences of the sentences in our big complex thing. So far, so good. Now the next step is we're going to use the characteristic tables to help us fill in the other columns. And the way we do it is by thinking about the order of complexity. This is why we talked so much about the grammar last week. So what we're going to think about is what was built next. So we had the atoms, right? What was built from the atoms? The negation, right? We added the negation to the C. What else was built from the atoms? The conjunction, right? So what we're going to use is the characteristic tables we talked about just a few minutes ago, and we'll use the characteristic tables to fill in these two columns. Right? So let's start with the negation column. Right? Now, the negation column, again, what does it do? It takes an input and flips it. Whatever truth value it gets, it gives you the output, right? The opposite. Where's the input column? Which one is it looking at? It's looking at C, right? So to fill this column in, all we have to do is look at the truth values under C. And then our negation just plays as a flipper. If there's a T coming in, it outputs an F. If there's an F coming in, it outputs a T. Make sense so far? So if we think about how to fill this column out, we get something like this. Again, all it's doing is it's taking in the values from here and it's outputting the opposite. Okay? Nice. Our next step is, again, filling in the next kind of highest level. So we've finished with our negation. We have to go back and think, hey, was there anything else built out of atoms? And we mentioned the other one built out of atoms. Which connective was it? The conjunction. Right? The conjunction is made of atoms. So we can fill in the column underneath it. And the way we do it is we use the characteristic truth table that we talked about for conjunction. But where are the input columns for it? We look at A and B. Right? And if we use the characteristic table that we talked about earlier for conjunction, we know that it's only true if both inputs are true. So we can fill it in like this, right? In our first one, it's true because A and B are both true. In our second row, it's true because A and B are both true. But from then on, it's always false. Because at least one, sometimes both, of the options are letting it down. Okay. Make sense so far? Again, all we're doing is we're basically going in the order of complexity. Start with the atoms, which we just assign truth values to. Then you think about the next level up that you built. And now we go the next level up. So we're going to fill in the column for the conditional. Where is this conditional going to look? What are the input columns? Yeah, right. So if we're going to look at the conditional, it's going to have, as always, two inputs. The two columns it's going to look at are the conjunction column and the negation column, right? So do we see what it's doing? We did the atoms first, and then it fixed the value for the next level. And then that level is going to fix the next level, and so on. And it'll be the same if it's a more complex sentence. Always the same pattern. We ascribe truth values to the atoms. That's what we did in the matrix. Then we use those to sort of set the truth values as we go on and on and on. So we've got our conditional. It's going to look at the conjunction and the negation. So we can fill it out. What's the truth value we fill in at the very top? Ooh, yeah. This one's false. Yeah. So remember, it's a conditional. And we remember the characteristic table for the conditional, right? What's the one time the conditional is false? Yeah, so consequence got to be false. What else? Antecedent true, consequent false. And if we look at the input columns here, antecedent's true, consequent is false. So our first row, the conditional, is going to get an F. So there we go. Just filling it in. Go like this. Again, so what are we doing? We fix the atoms. We fix the next level up. Just keep going upwards. And we use the characteristic tables to tell us what truth value to put in. Because the characteristic tables tell us, hey, if these are the input values, here's the output value. And we've done it with this sentence. We can do it with any TFL sentence. It does not matter how complex it is. The same process works every damn time. Beautiful. This is fucking amazing. This very simple, very mechanical process is actually just strong enough to evaluate the validity and virtue of form of pretty much everything you'd ever want to see. All you got to do, generate the matrix, follow the characteristic tables, and wham bam, the rest just falls out. It's lovely. So that's it. That's basically how to do complex tables. You build your matrix. Your matrix tells you all possible combinations, right? All the relevant notions of valuations, right? All the valuations. You copy them over, and then you go step by step by step. So, before we go on, pause, ask, what questions do you have for me on this one? Okay. So we're going to talk about these in the tutorials, and this is the kind of thing that you get a lot better at with practice, right? But the important thing is, again, getting the feeling for how this works. We fill in the atoms determine the next level, which determines the next level, and so on until we hit the main logical operator. Right? Okay. So let's try another one. In this sentence, we only have two. So we pulled out the two atoms, right? And our first step after pulling the atoms out is we've got to generate the matrix. So how do we generate the matrix for this sentence? So how do we, if we're going to fill out underneath C, what do we write? True, false, true, false. And how about under B? We double it up. Right? So there's our matrix. This gives us every possible valuation. It covers the whole of the relevant of possibility space. Now our next step, the next thing we do, we copy over the relevant columns. So the column under B, you copy it and you duplicate it under every occurrence of B over here. And the same thing with C. You take the column under C, you copy it, you paste it underneath every occurrence of C in your sentence. So we can fill it out like this. Okay. Now the next step is we have to figure out what's the next level of complexity, right? So what was built from the atoms? Where can we start by looking? Yeah, these two negations. These were the ones that are immediately above the atoms. So we have to start by filling in those columns. Unless we fill in these, we can't really do the rest. So we can start with this negation. Where is this negation going to look for its input? What's the input column? This B column, right? And so how do we fill out this? What would we write in here? False, false, true, true, right? Because negation just is a flipper. Whatever truth value you feed in, it gives you the opposite. Nice. Okay. Now, what would be next? What's the next one we can do? The other negation, right? The other negation. And what's the input column for it? It's the C, right? It's attached just directly to the C. So we take that and we do the same thing that we did before. Negation plays as a flipper. Right? We take in whatever's there, we flip it to the other truth value. With me so far? Okay. Now, what's next? The conjunction. Yeah, it's okay. Right? The conjunction. And where are our input columns here? What's the two negations, right? Do we see it? So the two negations are going to be our input columns. So we're going to look at the truth values here, and they're going to determine what letters we put in. So what's the column going to look like? Yeah. Good. So again, let's think about the way we would have to have built this sentence, right? If we look at how you had to have built this sentence, we can do that deconstruction method we talked about. So what's the main operator of the sentence? It's the negation, right? So it was built, and then the step below that was our conjunction, and it's attached to B and the other conjunction. So the structure of the sentence tells us the order we have to fill the columns in.
Like specifically for this conjunction, I mean, like looking at like the two negations.
Yes.
Like, how can we look at them and not like it's because those are the values that we got after we apply the negation to the C, right?
Yes. That's exactly what we're doing. You start with the atoms, and then you go each step along the way, right? So the atoms told us what the truth value for the negations were. The negations are the ones that are actually plugged into the conjunction. And then this conjunction is one of the two things plugged into that one. That's why we have to go step by step by step by step. Good question. Okay. So again, if we're looking at this conjunction, we look at the values, the input values from the negations, and we're going to get false, 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 true. Right? Now, is false, false, false true? Because conjunction requires both sides are true. And the only time that happens is at the very bottom row. There we go. Okay. Doing good so far. We only got 2 more columns. So, what's next? Where would we go to next? The other conjunction, right? That's our next level up. Now, where is our conjunction looking? What are the input columns for this conjunction? B and the conjunction we just filled in. They're the ones that are going to determine what truth values we plug in here. Yeah. Again, following the order of construction. So here, if we look, how's that column going to look? All false, right? Because there's no instance where both sides are true. Awesome. Okay. Now, last step. We've got our negation. Yeah, I'm coming to it. Nice. Right. Where's our input column for the negation? The conjunction we just did. And what's it going to be? All true, because it's a flipper, right? In this case, you're feeding in a column of F's, outputs a column of T's. Nice. Yes. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a second. Yes, basically. So before we talk about the semantic properties, do we get how this works? Do we get the machinery here? Again, no worries if it's not quite clicking yet. We're going to do some exercises, but is the general process clear here? Right? We generate our matrix. We use them to tell us the assigned truth values for the atoms, and then that just trickles upwards to tell us how each part goes. And again, if we set the matrix up right, this is telling us every possible valuation, right? Or at least every relevant possible valuation, which is all that matters. Okay, so here comes the fun part. This is where we actually get to use this machinery. Now, the important thing again is we can do this with any sentence you like, any complex sentence at all. And in fact, we can also do it with multiple sentences at the same time. We'll talk about that in just a second. But using this machinery, we can define up a bunch of new properties. So here's our first property. We'll say that a sentence is a tautology if and only if it's true in every valuation. Right? So a sentence is a tautology if and only if it's true in every valuation. Right? Now note, we've defined this in terms of valuations. Right? So this is something that's strictly speaking defined in terms of our machinery. Put another way, we can say, if you have a sentence that's true in every line of a complete table, then it's a tautology. Right? Now, put another way, and this comes back to your question. The notion of a tautology is not the same as that of a necessary truth. But every sentence that is a tautology will be a necessary truth. It's important to get that, right? Every tautology is a necessary truth, but not the other way around. And that's because at least some necessary truths will be so not in virtue of their structure, but in virtue of things like meaning. But if it's a necessary truth in virtue of its structure, it's a tautology. So, okay, have we seen a sentence that is a tautology? Have we come across one already? Yeah, we just did, right? Bang. Here's a tautology. This sentence is true on every valuation. In every line of the table, it's getting a T. So it is a tautology. Another notion we can define here is that of a contradiction. Now, this is a technical term, so this isn't your usual conception of a contradiction. This is a technical notion. We'll say a sentence, a TFL sentence, is a contradiction if and only if it's false on every valuation. Right? That is, thinking about it in terms of our machinery, in every line on the table, the sentence gets an F. Lots of respect paid. Right? So have we seen a sentence that is a contradiction? Well, let's go back. Yeah, if we take the sub-sentence here, just the conjunction inside, it's a contradiction, right? If you just look at the sentence that has that conjunction as the main operator, it is a contradiction. It is false in every valuation. So, you've already been told implicitly how you can use the machinery to test for these properties. Write the sentence in your table, run through everything, and then look. Look at the column for the main operator. If the main operator is all T's, what do you have? It's a tautology, right? If it's all T's, it's a tautology. If it's all F's, you've got a contradiction, right? This is how we start to use our machinery. Now we should note, again, these are not the same as the notions we talked about before, but they are technical versions. Right? A contradiction is something that's necessarily false in virtue of its form. A tautology is something that's necessarily true in virtue of its form. Right? There might be other ways to be necessarily false or necessarily true, but we're capturing versions of that with our machinery. Okay, so we've got those two. Yes? No. So every sentence that's a tautology must be a necessary truth, because its logical structure is such that it must be true. The structure alone guarantees the sentence is true, no matter what the atoms actually say.
Necessary truth cannot be a tautology.
Or at least it's possible to be a necessary truth and not a tautology. Right? So here's why you might have that. If the sentence is necessarily true because of the meaning of the constituent parts, then it would not be one of these, but it would still be necessarily true. It's the meaning of the parts. Again, this kind of comes back to the important thing. When we're doing TFL, all we're thinking about is the truth functionality, the logical structure in this really basic way. Does the truth of these parts entail the truth of the whole? Right? So the toggles and the switches, that's it. We don't care about what the toggles and switches actually turn on or off, what they mean in some sense. So we're setting all of that aside. And because we're setting all of that aside, this is the closest we can come. We can only talk about sentences that are true in every valuation or false in every valuation. So you had a question as well?
You could even think of a tautology that isn't necessary falsehood in terms of meaning.
Meaning, right? Yeah. So again, this is a way to capture this kind of more generalized notion defined in terms of our machinery. So the other thing to note in all of the definitions I'm going to be giving you, remember the thing we kind of started with. Every definition here is going to have this word in it. All of the things we're going to talk about are characterized in terms of valuations. And what's a valuation again? Do we remember?
An assignment of truth values where something sensitive.
Yeah. So to some, right? It could just be one, it might be a bunch. Or another way to think about it, it's a row on the table. And if we're talking about all, then it's going to be all the relevant rows. Okay, so there's our first two notions. We can also talk about this notion. We can say that two sentences are tautologically equivalent if and only if they have the same truth value on every valuation. So I'll repeat the definition. Two sentences are tautologically equivalent if and only if they have the same truth value on every valuation. Note, this doesn't mean that, they're always true or they're always false. It's just that whenever one's got true, so does the opposite, and vice versa. They line up in every valuation. Thinking about it in terms of our tables, if two sentences match up perfectly on every row of our table, then they're tautologically equivalent. And we can test this using our tables. Specifically what we do, we look at the columns under the sentence's main operators. And if the columns are exactly the same, then they're going to be tautologically equivalent. So we can give an example. Yeah.
How can they be more than one and be multiple operating types?
Good. So we're talking about multiple sentences, right? That's right. Two sentences. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. It'll make it easier. So here's one. We're going to show that these two are tautologically equivalent. Right? We've talked about neither nor. Here's two ways to symbolize neither nor. Right? We want to show that they're, from TFL's perspective, the same sentence. Right? So here's how we do it. We can write our two sentences all along the same line. We pull out all the atoms from all of the sentences taken together. In this case, it's just P and Q. And then we generate our matrix like normal. Right? So we could do this with just one sentence, or we can do it with multiple. Just make sure you leave yourself a gap so you don't screw up the table. Right? Then, the next step, just like always, copy. Import the columns. Right? Every occurrence of P, you fill in the column under P. Every occurrence of Q, you fill in the column under Q. And then our next step, we go to the next level up, right? So what would be the next columns we could fill in? Well, so we could do the negations here. What else could we fill in? The disjunction, right? The ones that were built immediately out of atoms. This disjunction and these two negations, right? Do we see how that was what was built? So we can say, fill in this negation. This negation is going to look at the Q. You just feed in the truth value. It outputs the opposite. No problem. And then if we move to our other negation here, this negation, where is it looking? Where's its input column? The P it's attached to, right? And we do the same thing. What goes in, the opposite comes out. Now, let's just stick over here. If we're going to fill in the conjunction, where is it going to look? What's its input columns? The two negations, right? The input column for our conjunction are the two negations we just filled in. Right? That's the next level up. And in this case, right, again, our conjunction, difficult to please. It's only happy if both inputs are true. So we have false, 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 true. Nice. Nice. Okay. Now we can jump over to the other sentence. Note, We've now filled in the column for the main logical operator here. So let's do the other sentence. If we look at this disjunction, how would we fill out this column? Right? So it's a disjunction. It's attached to the two atoms. Disjunctions are easy to please. So if even one truth is on either side, it's true. So true, 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 false. Beautiful, beautiful. Now what? What's next? We go to the negation. Where is it looking? What's the input column? The disjunction we just filled in. Right? And just like before, we know what negation does. Whatever its input, it outputs the opposite. It's a flipper. Right? So we get false, 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 true. And note, what we've done now is built a table for these two sentences together. To tell if these are tautologically equivalent, we look at the columns of their main operators. And these columns have to be identical. That is, whenever there's a T, it's got to be in both. Whenever there's an F, it's got to be in both. If there's any difference at all, they are not equivalent. And we look and see, hey, they're the exact same. So these sentences are tautologically equivalent. We've just proven it using a table. And all of the appropriate valuations, they have the exact same truth value. So, if I ask you a question like this on the midterm, which I'm definitely going to do, right? You have the idea of how to do it, how to use the machinery to test for tautological equivalence. Okay. There are also a few more notions we want to define. Two of them should look very familiar. Our top two. We have some sentences, A1 through AN, are jointly tautologically consistent, if and only if there's some valuation that makes them all true. Or to put another way, if there's at least one row on our table where everyone's got a T under the main operator, they are jointly tautologically consistent. This should be ringing alarm bells, right? This is very similar to joint consistency that we talked about in lecture 1. But instead of just a general notion of possibility, we've defined it in terms of evaluation. Similarly, some sentences are jointly tautologically inconsistent, if and only if there's no valuation that makes them all true. So all you need is one line on the table where they're all true, and you need it to be such that there are no lines on the table at all where they are all true. So these two are very similar to what we had before. Now our third notion is slightly strange, and it's worth it because it's going to give us the big money. So we'll say that some sentences, A1 through AN, tautologically entail a sentence C, if and only if there's no valuation of the atomic sentences that make up A1 through AN true and C false. So that's a very long-winded way to say these ones tautologically entail C, if and only if there's no no row on the table where all of the A's are true and the C is false. Yeah, it does, doesn't it? So, validity was defined purely in terms of possibility. This notion is defined in terms of valuations, but it's going to be the magic sauce. This is how we're going to test for validity. So this is one of the key notions, right? So A1 through AN tautologically entail C, if and only if there's no valuation that make A1 through AN true and C false, exactly mirroring validity. But importantly, defined in terms of valuations. That's why that notion of evaluation is the key. Everything is built out of it. So we can express tautological entailment by this double turnstile. So this is just a fancy way to say that A1 through AN tautologically entail C. Or to put another way, it says there's no valuation where the stuff on the left is true and the one on the right is false. Couple things about the double turnstile. There's no limit to the number of sentences that can be on the left, but the right-hand side is always just one. To give it its proper name, it's variably polyadic on the left. I'm never going to ask you that, but it's just handy to know the fancy terms. Notably, the double turnstile is not a symbol of TFL. It's a way for us to talk about a relationship between sentences and TFL. It's a way for us to symbolize that if you built a table using these, the table will be such that there's no line where these ones are true and that one's false. That's all it says. There's no valuation where the stuff on the left's true and the thing on the right's false. But of course, that's also a very handy little tool for other things, because we can write it like this, where nothing is to the left of the double turnstile. And this tells us that whatever sentence C is, it's a tautology, because nothing at all entails it. You can get it from anything you like. Other way around, we can also write it like this. And this tells us that C is a contradiction. It entails anything you like. Now, there's a tight relationship between a conditional claim, being a tautology, and an entailment, a tautological entailment relation holding. Because if this is the case, then there's no way to make these true and this false. So the conditional must then be a tautology, because the only way to make the conditional false is for the first bits to be true and the second bit false. So we just join these up with a conjunction to get the antecedent. And then that's going to be a tautology if and only if the entailment relation holds. But the big trick, the big connection about entailment is that it gives us a way to capture validity. So we spoiled it, but if we read this, it should feel a lot like validity, just in terms of valuations. That means we can say this. If A1 through AN tautologically entails C, then the argument A1 through AN is premises, conclusion C is valid. So I'll say this again. If there's this relationship between these sentences and that sentence, then we know the corresponding argument must be valid. And it must be valid because, if A1 through AN tautologically entails C, it is impossible to make A1 through AN true and C false, which is exactly what validity tells us. So tautological entailment gives us a way to capture validity. This is the big payoff for our language and our system. We take English, we turn it into TFL, we feed it into our truth table machinery. And our truth table machinery tells us whether the premises tautologically entail the conclusion. If they do, we know that the argument has a good form. We know the argument is valid. There might be other reasons to worry about it, but at least we know it passes the bar of the truth of the premises guaranteeing the truth of the conclusion. That's what the whole damn language is set up to do, to be able to let us do that transition, to make this claim. Very cool. So, again, the important thing with all of these semantic concepts, the notion of a tautology and a contradiction, notion of jointly tautologically consistent or inconsistent, tautological equivalence, and tautological entailment. Every one of them is defined in terms of a valuation, an assignment of truth values to the relevant atomic sentences. We use that together with our tables to tell us the rest of these properties, to say when they hold, when they don't hold. The machinery, the tables are ways to test for these properties. It's always done in terms of valuations. That's what all of this is based around. That's why it's so important that the language is truth functional. If it wasn't truth functional, then the valuations wouldn't do the job. Merely assigning truth values to the atoms wouldn't help us do the rest. Okay. So we have a tool for determining whether an argument's valid. We symbolize the argument into TFL. We use tables to determine whether the premises tautologically entail the conclusion. And if they do, hey! And if they don't, we have the model that shows where they fail. We know when the argument fails. Why is it invalid? Because I can make these sentences true in this way, and this conclusion false in this way, and the premises are all true and the conclusion false. We don't have to worry about weird notions of possibility. It's going to be actually just directly baked in. Okay, cool. So this gives us a way, again, to determine invalidity too. All we do is find the valuation where the premises are true and the conclusion's false. You'll read it off the table. It's magic. Absolute magic. Okay. So I think we're going to call it quits here. We're not going to talk about the shortcuts. I'll upload a little video about me talking about these. Basically, the important thing for us is that we know how to use these tables. We know the basic process. So familiarize yourself with the characteristic tables for each of the operators. Familiarize yourself with how to build the complete tables. We're going to talk about these in the tutorials. Importantly, we are done with TFL! Good job, guys. Of course, that means it's on to the really hard stuff next. So, have a read over the materials and questions. Take care, and we'll see you in tutorials.